As Singapore marks its World War II past, historians have immortalised the men and women who helped defend the island. The Books of Remembrance, which are burial records of those who died in the conflict between 1941 and 1945, have been digitised online. Spanning 9 volumes, the books contain the names and death dates of 27,000 people, many of them locals who fought under the ban of various volunteer forces. These books found a home in the Graham White Library in St Andrew's Cathedral in 1953, but were lost and forgotten between 1970 and 1990 when the cathedral was renovated. They were found again in 2012. And joining us tonight to share more about them is Dr. Joseph Thambiah. He's associate professor at the National University of Singapore and also People's Warden at St Andrew's Cathedral. Dr. Thambiah, beyond just being burial records, what do these books tell us about the people of that time?
Well, thank you for having me on the show. Now, I think we ought to bear in mind that the Books of Remembrance are more than just a list of names. It's in reality a roll of honor, and not just of professional soldiers. It's also a list of ordinary men and women in Singapore who came forward at the time of their country's need and gave the ultimate sacrifice of their lives to defend their families and the nation. And their sacrifices have not been forgotten. And many of these locals served in the various volunteer forces, amongst them the Singapore Volunteer Forces. Now, by day, they were teachers, clerks, and office workers. But in the evenings and on weekends, they would undergo military training. And because they were not professional, many of them perished. Now, to remember them and to remember the others who died in the battle for Singapore, the colonial authorities worked with the Anglican Church to build a memorial hall, which is an annex to St Andrew's Cathedral. And on the facade of this memorial hall is visible the emblems of the different units who fought in the war. And while you would expect to see the armed forces of Britain and the US and Australia and the Netherlands and so on, pride of place was also given to the local volunteer forces, particularly the Singapore Volunteer Force with its proud motto, In Oriente Primus, meaning the first in the East. And I think at this time, even as we look at the 80th anniversary of the fall of Singapore, this is a reminder to all of us of the sacrifices that have been made by our forefathers.
Dr. Thambiah, a roll of honor to those who lived and died at that time. We know that there are these 9 volumes to the Books of Remembrance. How do they differ?
Right. Now, they're quite interesting, actually. If you look at volumes 1 to 4 of the Books of Remembrance, they actually memorialize those who died and were buried in Burma and in Thailand. So you might wonder that it might seem a little bit odd. We're talking about the Warden in Singapore, and we're remembering those who were buried in Burma and in Thailand. And the reason for this is that all of these were POWs and men who were carted up by train for 5 days and 5 nights to Kanchanaburi in Thailand to work on the infamous Death Railway. And many of them perished during that terrible time and were buried there. Now, Volume 5 is close to our hearts because this memorializes those who are buried in Kranji War Cemetery in Singapore. But to me, the saddest of those 9 volumes is probably volumes 8 and 9, because in these volumes you find the names of those who fought and died in the battle for Singapore, but whose bodies were never recovered. And so there were no graves to remember them by, and there was never really any finality or closure for the families.
Dr. Thambiah, thank you very much for joining us this evening and talking to us about these Books of Remembrance. That was Dr. Joseph Thambiah, Associate Professor at NUS and also People's Warden at St Andrew's Cathedral.